Start. All right. Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to read your bio real quick. Vice President of Customer Success at ESG, focused on evolving and expanding the business. ESG advises client leaders and teams on best practices for all aspects of customer success and customer engagement. You have deep expertise in customer success enablement and voice of the customer programs, with over 5 years leading those practices at Oracle, not a small company. Guest lecturer at the University of San Francisco in the Customer Success MBA program. And you recently, I believe it came out last year, co-authored a paper called Customer Success Attitudes to Training Certification and CPD. I don't know what CPD is.
Professional development.
Professional development.
I forget what it is. Oh, continual professional development.
Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad to have you here.
Well, thank you, Peter. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to, we mentioned Oracle and you mentioned you've been in customer success for a little while. You don't have to put a number on it. But we'd love to start with just hearing a little bit more about your background and how you ended up in the named world of customer success.
Sure. I've gotten pretty good, I think, at answering this question. I kind of trace it back to pre-sales. I was a solution consultant, solution engineer with BMC Software in the early 2000s, and I spent an extraordinary amount of time not just technically selling the product and supporting sales, but also servicing customers. That was before customer success was really a thing, and so we otherwise were called technical account managers too. And so I had the big banks in Canada, I had a number of telcos. Jillian Taylor's on this session here, and she's in Vancouver. And so I spent a lot of time in Vancouver at TELUS, a big telco company in Canada. And I really understood after a time that I had an affinity for working closely with customers, trying to understand what they needed, and then try to marry our strategy and our service delivery to meet those needs. So I spent a lot of time orchestrating effort from the BMC product teams, support teams, service teams to address needs, and had a lot of success turning my champions into like public-facing entities. So they would speak at our kickoffs and that kind of stuff. So I basically built kind of a small army of advocates. And then, but towards 2010, 12, when customer success was becoming a thing, I just realized, well, that's what I was doing for like up to 10 years. And so I moved quickly into official status as a customer success architect, and then rapidly into doing research. I worked at TSIA as a researcher, and then I just got a lot of notoriety, very public, really active on social media, did a lot of writing and speaking at conferences. And then Oracle just grabbed me, recruited me to help build out their practice. And with this particular focus, as you said, on voice of the customer, but I owned the enablement practice for about 5 years. And so really revamped that. We had a big cohort of CSMs to educate, up to like 200 or so.
Yeah.
And so, I just kept going, and then ESG kind of noticed me and really started talking to me last summer about moving over.
Yeah. So can you say a bit more about the motivation to join ESG?
Yeah. So ESG, they trademarked the phrase customer success as a service. And so what they do is they provide the capabilities to help companies build out customer success, all the fundamental elements you can think of, including staffing, if that's something companies want. But we do assessments, we do journey mapping, we do enablement, we do a voice of the customer. So basically any of the core building blocks for customer success, ESG provides that. And I was excited about joining them because I believe they're really filling a great need in the market for advisory programs. I know there's a lot of companies doing some flavor of these things, but I believe ESG has a good comprehensive kind of platform for this. And I met, the CEO a number of years ago, and I've stayed in touch with he and a couple of the VPs who work at ESG, and they become friends. And I didn't think about joining them, but then they started talking to me about it. So I'm just happy that I feel like I'm at a company that's on the kind of leading edge of driving kind of what I call modern customer success.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of excitement in the market to move more firmly and assertively in the direction of like digital customer success, which is something that we're really skilled at. So.
Yeah. So you mentioned one of the areas is hiring, and I think that's a particular area of interest for me and for a lot of people, not least of which because it's been seemingly really difficult to hire fast enough recently. And now there seems to be a real shift in the macroeconomic environment where we're starting to see a lot of layoffs. And so there's a lot of churn in the world of CS employment. And so we'd love to have your thoughts and reflections on that.
Yeah, there is. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people have lost their jobs despite all the hard work they've put in the last few years. Through no fault of their own, they find themselves, without a job. So I would, recommend to people who find themselves in that situation, or even people who have a job in customer success, that they consider that there's changing needs in customer success, and those changing needs are driven from external forces. I'm meaning that the customer's expectations continue to rise. That will not stop. Technology continues to improve. That will not stop. The world's changing all the time, as we see around us. A lot of it's awful. But what that means is that the macro climate, as you mentioned, Peter, continues to impact everybody. So how do you protect yourself? I think as much as you can, as you focus on what do you think the skills are going to be that are required in your function, your business function going forward. And I recommend people get really good at analyzing information. I'm not saying everyone needs to be a data analyst. What I am saying, though, is you have to have a strong appreciation for inflows of information that you can then digest and assimilate and figure out what does it say. And you need to get really skilled at being able to communicate whatever insights you can glean from that stuff. And so I think if you can kind of demonstrate that kind of ability to interpret signals and information that's coming from a variety of sources, and you can be able to tell a story around that that's supported by data, then that's very powerful. And that could put you in a good position to enjoy what I predict will be kind of the next rapidly growing phase of customer success, which is really around digital. And I think that the digital piece is inevitable. It's going to be, more prominent, probably the prominent, method of customer success in the next years, because there's really no choice. Going back to the technology, the customer expectations, technology is getting really great at being able to get in front of things. And I'm talking more about AI, of course. But those tools should augment and really complement and help customer success improve the way they anticipate issues customers might be facing, and then get ahead of it with information that they can help customers by guiding them forward over obstacles that may or may not be in front of them yet, but probably will be. So I again just kind of recommend CSMs to, or not just CSMs, but all customer success professionals, to start thinking more around customer success needs to continue to evolve to a really standard business practice that has credibility, that's built on scalable models, that senior C-level executives can look at the function and say, yeah, you finally arrived, you've finally grown up, you're finally in the same camp as sales, as marketing, as support, these other engines of the company that have been around for decades and have figured out their processes and have figured out how to do things at scale. So customer success needs to kind of get there. And I think it is on the right road, but it's going to require people to kind of behave a little differently going forward.
Yeah. If we can double click into that upskilling piece a little bit more, kind of regardless of where you sit in the CS org. It sounds like there's at least a few different pieces that you're describing. One is the ability to take a bunch of potentially disparate data points and craft the narrative. That could be a narrative for one client or a narrative across clients. And then I think you're saying there's another piece of where you actually pull that data from. How are you getting access to data within the organization? And so I guess it's a bit of a choose your own adventure question. We could talk a little bit more about like crafting the narrative, or we can talk a little bit more about where are you pulling all those data points from that help you craft the narrative to begin with.
Yeah, I think we can probably talk about both, because to tell an accurate narrative, I think you have to look at as many possible kind of inputs as possible, because the truth is somewhere there, and you need to kind of figure out what the truth is, and as many angles as possible will generate that truth for you. So for example, your customer, we conventionally kind of look at the customer and say, okay, what's their NPS? So that's just like one data point though. And most people understand that's insufficient, but too many companies rely on that. That's a bit of a vanity metric. So I'm saying that, even as an individual, but better as an organization, you should look at multiple kind of signals as a way to kind of triangulate an opinion about the customer, what their trajectory is, what their aspirations are. Even if they've said A, B, and C are our goals, maybe they're behaving and saying things in a way that might indicate C isn't really their goal, maybe D is their goal. And maybe that should guide your conversation with them in a kind of respectful, leading way, and say, you've seen these things, this is kind of the trajectory you're on. We should think about maybe, can you explain a little bit better for us? Is that true? Is what we see true? Is this a change in your business?
Yep.
And then, so I guess what I'm saying is that the narrative is formed by these variety of kind of signals that you're getting, including direct one-to-one or one to a few conversations you have with your customer. But going back to what I said about digital, you're not going to have that opportunity so much with a lot of accounts. So you have to get good at looking at a variety of signals. And that's what we were building at Oracle and Voice of the Customers. Maybe like, I forget how many, there was maybe 20 signals that we were always digesting, that we would then correlate and figure out, okay, what is that saying to us? It's not true. And and so many customers were all different from each other, of course. So it requires an ongoing effort to figure out what the signals are trying to say. And you just have to keep getting better at it. So I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but I think what I'm saying is the narrative is something that requires you to have a bit of an open mind about looking at your market, looking at your customers, and understanding that the narrative will change again too. So it goes back to, how are you going to do this at scale? You need technology, you need kind of discipline, you need to collaborate with lots of people to figure out the model going forward. And again, that model is not going to be static.
Yeah, and to some extent, curiosity and figuring out what the right question to ask is, whether you're asking it of the client or of the client's data.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Of the data. That's a really good point, because more often than not, you're not going to have the access to the client, or the client might not even know how to answer the question, because they might not have as much of a view that you actually do of them. Because maybe they're focused on a single thing, single kind of function within the company, and you have a broader purview of what's going on.
Yeah, we've heard of CSMs now having as many as 200 accounts.
Yeah, for sure.
And in that case, I don't know how you would survive if you weren't looking at aggregate data and then trying to pick off specific clients from that, depending as outliers. That starts to sound really, really challenging.
It's very challenging, but you have to start somewhere, and you start with a small cohort of customers, and figure out if you can develop kind of a model that you have confidence in, that the results are accurate. And again, you're testing the results by talking to the real customers and saying, okay, this is what we're finding. And, is that what you think too? So the voice of the customer is very powerful in that regard. And it's not just it's not a program that you just put in place to watch and observe. You actually kind of take that information that you're learning from the voice of the customer and bring it back to, a small cohort of customers and say, this is what we're noticing. Can you help us understand whether this is true or not? And then you just keep getting better at it.
Right. And then Nina in the chat asked a question that I think is tangential, but not that far off from what we're talking about, which is basically if you're looking to be hired by an organization, what types of questions should you be asking that organization? And so that kind of gets into, well, how is the CS org at that company behaving to begin with? And what are the signs to look out for in a company you might really want to work for, or the sort of red flags in a company you don't want to work for?
Yeah, I think it all depends on what you want. A lot of CSMs still, well, I shouldn't say still, that sounds kind of negative, but they believe that, the best customer success is like a direct one-to-one relationship, and that, you can drive successful outcomes with customers with that kind of really strong interpersonal relationships you have with like real human beings at the account. And I'm not arguing that that's not true. I've had great success at that. I'm just saying that that's not achievable to the extent that CFOs and CEOs need, and the market needs, and the investors need. And so we really don't have a choice, but we have to get better at that. So when you're interviewing with companies, let's say that that's all true, and you have to look for companies that have a better, more forward-looking kind of mindset around leveraging data to drive service, better service for customers, then you should probably stay away from companies that can't answer with any sort of level of confidence for you how they use data. So I would not be shy about asking them, how they look at the customer, what programs are in place to discover how the customer is doing, how successful they are being, or what kind of success are they experiencing. And if people struggle answering that question, then that should be a red flag, I would say. I think, especially in customer success, if you're interviewing with a leader in customer success, they should be able to speak to you about the programs that they have in place to not just, as we say, drive successful outcomes, but how are they paying attention along the way, without direct human interaction all the time? Do they rely on CSMs to be that voice of each customer? That should tell you something too, right? Because again, that's not scalable. I think that's the angle I would suggest people go towards, is probe them on data programs, because that should surface how forward thinking they are, and it should lead the thinking you might have around, you probably want to work for a company that pays attention to the whole customer experience, not just about customer success. And so if they can, with confidence and maybe even some enthusiasm, talk about how they believe the customer experience is, of course, critical, but how they actually are trying to improve it, then that's a good conversation you should be having in an interview, and you should be excited perhaps of, joining them at some point.
I talked to a company last week that did an annual bonus for every employee at the company. So it was a company-wide bonus based on customer retention. It was outside of just the CS part of the company. It was so that touched product engineers, salespeople, everybody.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. It might be seen as symbolic, but symbolism is important too. It sends a message that everyone needs to be part of the answer, and the answer is we need to keep our customers, and it shouldn't just be up to customer success. That's a great thing to probe and look for in interviews, is like how do they see the responsibility for retention? And sometimes, there are companies that say we expect customer success to own that number and drive it up. And I think we all know on this call that it's really difficult for customer success to do that on its own, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we talked about in part of your bio, and I read an abbreviated version of your bio, by the way, you've done a lot of other great things too. But I mentioned that report that you'd authored that came out last year, or co-authored rather, on customer success attitudes. And that was, I think, looking at the attitudes of leadership of companies to customer success. And it seems to vary widely. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, that report, the prime focus of that report was around education and training. And so we were interested in seeing if there's a correlation between the amount of investment made in training customer success professionals that a company invests in, and the results they might be having in the business, i.e. retention, growth, expansion. And the main KPIs that we look at in customer success, whether there's if there's insufficient investment or a lower investment, whether that results in what we our thesis was that it results in poor outcomes for the metrics. And the survey we did was pretty large, and we had it open for about 4 or 5 months, and we had a lot of data come back, but we also did a lot of interviews too. And the conclusions were, yeah, that there is a correlation between insufficient education and training, and the outcomes that a company or business function enjoyed or didn't enjoy. But through all that, we also understood that so much of the education and training, of course, investment wasn't controlled by customer success leaders. It's controlled by the broader business and the way that business looks at customer success. So those accounts or those companies where customer success was seen more as an adjunct to support and really more of an escalation engine than anything else, very poor investment in customer success, education, and training. And so, and I see on the chat, there's talk about active listening and all that. That, of course, that stuff never occurred in those kinds of accounts. Those kinds of more evolved skills would be more at play or included in the companies that reported better results around retention, better scores for expansion, and they would also say that they're actually getting, maybe, I forget the number of hours per year, but they would report higher hours of training versus the other cohort that was suffering on the KPI side. So it was a really fascinating kind of study. I thought it's out there on Amazon. It's really, I think it's like $2.99 or maybe 99 cents now, whatever. It's easy. It's long. It's about 100 pages, but it's got a lot of, we break it down. I think it's an interesting read. We wrote it more like stories. So it's not just raw data that we're pumping at you. It's
going back to the narrative.
Narrative around every chapter and stuff. So
yeah, and that's it's good, and I think really helpful to have a conversation around how do you find an ideal employer, and most of us on the call are probably currently employed, and so there's also a conversation around how do you work within the organization that you have. And even if you're looking for a job, you're going to end up facing that question. And so do you have any thoughts around how to advocate for an increased role of CS within your existing organization?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is having empathy and appreciation for other organizations. So if you really want, let's say you're interviewing for a job. There's 2 ways to look at this. You're interviewing for a job. I think a good way to demonstrate kind of a modern sensibility about customer success is to ask questions around how the organization works with sales and marketing and customer support and services, because that should clue in people that you're thinking that customer success needs to be part of an effort of orchestration for servicing customers. And I think any sort of leader who's interviewing you, who's kind of plugged in and understands really the modern way of thinking about customer success, would be excited by that line of questioning. because it exposes the hard reality that it's a tough job. It's a really hard job, bringing successful outcomes or helping customers achieve successful outcomes. And it's just a good acknowledgement that, you're not kind of just glossing things over. You actually want to be part of that. And so back to the other piece, I think to help, if you're in an account or you're in a company, you're employed, you're gainfully employed, you're doing well, but there's challenges in customer success, then I think it helps if you try to understand the point of view of these other organizations. So sales has a point of view, marketing support does, services does, and they're all valid. And, I think there's risk in customer success community of becoming too much of an echo chamber. And I think it's important that, yes, it's good to be proud of being part of this business function, but it's also important to level set, knowing that those other organizations are also, they're not led by stupid people. They're actually transforming themselves. We talk about transformation a lot in customer success, but those other organizations are also on board. They're reading a lot of the same kind of Harvard Business Review articles, MIT. So they also know they do have to transform and, around their idea of what the customer is. So it helps if you understand what they're measured, how they measure success for themselves. And it helps to then you have better conversations, I think, to advance your need to have customer success be, not just at the table, but be seen as a vital instrument for the company going forward to be close to the customers, whether it's digital or like high touch, to really drive successful outcomes. Customer success needs the participation of these other groups, but they're not going to get it if there's not an understanding of how customer success can bring value to those other organizations. So know what sales is measured against, what marketing is, and then see if through your execution of the customer success model brings value for those other organizations. And the easy way to think of it is, of course, marketing needs leads, sales needs, additional kind of opportunities. And that comes from strong customers who become advocates, of course. And so if you can kind of figure out how to have that conversation and really zero in on what their KPIs are, then that's you'll have a welcome audience for sure to have more conversations and maybe even some collaboration.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Peter, this went by so quickly. We're already past the half hour. We are, for everyone on the call, we're going to transition over to a networking portion in a different platform called Kumo Space. I'll go ahead and drop the link here in the chat so that you can go ahead and start working your way in that direction. Peter, I think you'd said you'd be able to make the transition. And so anyone who comes across can have their chance to ask Peter questions directly. Peter, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time with us. And we're looking forward to the second half of the event.
Of course. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining if you're dropping off now. But yeah, please come over if you have the time.
Amazing. Thank you. We'll see everybody there.